Verse 7 to 9 is actually very easy to understand. Paul comes and talks about leaven. And when he talks about leaven, the understanding of leaven in the context of doctrine is actually a wrong doctrine. And in the case when Jesus was talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, he was talking about the teaching or the doctrine of the Pharisees. And Jesus warned his disciples against the teaching of the Pharisees. Now, here the Apostle Paul comes and says basically the same thing. It's not in the case of a warning, but it is in the case of somebody that has not adhered to the warning of watching out for a wrong teaching. It says from verse 5, chapter 5, verse 7 to 9, it reads as follows. It says, "You did run well. Who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? This persuasion comes not of him that called you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump." Now, what Paul comes and he says here, he says, you did run well. He talks about this as a race. He says, you did run well, but someone hindered you. And he says, who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? Now, I want to ask you this. How do you think of it like this? How do you obey truth? How do you obey truth? Let's say somebody has died, and I say to you that this person has died, and you thought that he was dead, but he has now been risen from the dead, and he is now the Lord of all. And let's say that is so. It is the truth. How do you obey that truth? You conduct your life according to that truth now. That is how it is. It's like in South Africa when we got Nelson Mandela as president. The moment Nelson Mandela became president of the nation and we had a new constitution, the truth was that the old South Africa has passed away and that we have now gotten a new South Africa, and that all of us is now part of this new resurrection. A nation was born in one day. And the truth was that the old has passed away and that everything has now become new. So what would obedience to the truth be but to conduct your life not according to what was, but what is? By simply believing it and not trying to work the old. So he comes here and he says, who has hindered you that you should not obey the truth? How do you obey the truth that Jesus was raised from the dead? You believe upon it, you have your expectation from it, you've got your hope from that, and you rest in that truth. And as you do that, as you obey the truth, or you obey the faithfulness of God towards you, by seeing yourself as part of it and yielding yourself to that truth, what happens? You find that that truth really starts to shape and form your life. Now Paul goes on in chapter 5 verse 8, he says, this persuasion comes not of him that calls you. So what he's saying here, he says, this message that you have received, where you've received wrong teaching amongst you, it doesn't come from God, neither does it come from Paul, who called them in the beginning. And we've seen in chapter 1 that they quickly fall away from Paul, the one that called them in the beginning. But here it is not past tense, it says from him that calleth you, or calls you. And I believe in this case, it talks about God that is continually calling them to believe and trust and rely upon God and not the law. And he says, this persuasion, this new mindset, this thing that you're now believing does not come from God, neither does it come from me. Then he says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, meaning that should you go and grab a little bit of this law, it will destroy your whole life. We've seen that firsthand with friends that we've had. I mean, in my heart, the man is still my friend. But this person started to love the Jewish customs and the Jewish way of doing. And he first started out with following certain of the feasts, and then keeping the Sabbath, and then reading on the Jews and those kind of things, but in the meantime also professing Jesus. And I remember one day, this would be about 17 years ago, 15 years ago, he came to visit my house, and I said to him, I said, brother, I am, like the Apostle Paul said here, I'm concerned for you, because the more you're going to love this other thing, the law, the less you're going to love God or Jesus. And he says, no, he promises me he will never turn his back on Jesus, and he will never not believe in the Messiah, and those kind of things. There was a little leaven that came into his life. Now, 17 years later, the man calls Jesus Christ an absolute liar. He says he's a deceiver, he is an enemy of God. So, and I think this is what Paul has got in mind here. He says here, you've run well, but someone has hindered you. This persuasion does not come from him who calls you. It talks about falling from grace. It talks about not being under the power of God. It talks about not having any of the benefits. You can see he's putting everything out there to tell them, to warn them, to show them, and to speak love to them and concern from the heart of a true apostolic father. And then he says in the end here, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And I think that was something that was going around there. I don't think he would just have said that for no reason. It must have been something that was going around that that Jesus has said, maybe this has come to the ears of the people in Galatia here, and now they are at a place where they can draw on that and say, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees, watch out for the leaven of, I would put my own words here, the Sadducees. Watch out for this leaven, watch out for this doctrine, for it will eventually leaven the whole lump, and then you will be destroyed by this message. You're running the risk of not partaking in what God has promised you. That is Galatians 5, verse 7 to 9.